Dr. Harris, thank you so much for joining me today.
Glad to be here, Steve. Thanks.
So I've got to ask you, how does someone end up becoming a writer of LSAT questions? How do you get into the
Uh,
business?
uh, I was a philosophy grad student, and in the olden days, they had this periodical that came out called Jobs for Philosophers. And at the very end of that periodical, they had non-academic jobs. And so beggars can't be choosers. I applied to pretty much everything, and I got a job as an item writer. That was in '92, right as I was finishing up my PhD, and did it for about 5 years after that.
So how many LSAT questions did you end up writing, and how many of those were accepted?
Probably wrote somewhere between 400 and 500, and 90% or so were accepted.
Oh, wow. That's a really high acceptance rate. I know that they're very stringent with what they take.
Yeah, and a lot of us started out doing this when they first put out the call, and very few of us stuck it out. It was the training was grueling. There were a lot of rejections at first, so there's a learning curve. There's a learning curve, definitely.
I remember a while back when we were speaking, you referenced this book they gave you with guidelines for writing LSAT questions, and I'm sure this book is a very closely guarded secret, but I'm wondering if there's anything you remember from it that stood out that you could share.
It was actually very helpful. They gave they broke. Presumably, they had one for each of the 3 item types. I only got one for logical reasoning and analytical reasoning. But not only would they give exemplars of good items, but they also gave examples of common mistakes to make. I think that was the first time I really became attuned to some of the differences between subtypes of items. So for instance, necessary and sufficient assumptions. I don't think I was really that sensitive to the distinction until I looked at the item writing guidelines. Another thing that struck me is how what counts as an inference in logical reasoning is different from what counts as an inference in reading comp. In logical reasoning, when they talk about inferences, they almost always have in mind the strict logical notion of an inference, implication. Whereas in reading comp, it's much more like a psychological notion. So somebody who says this probably has this, what other idea bouncing around in their head. And that getting used to that distinction took a little while too.
Oh, wow. That's a really interesting point. So maybe it's a bit more looser and a bit more reading between the lines when it comes to reading comp, would you say?
Absolutely. So when I talk about this to students, invariably somebody has some food or a drink on their table or whatever, and we'll have just covered logical reasoning assumptions, which are, for all intents and purposes, missing premises of one type or another. And then I'll walk around the classroom and say, "Hey, you done with those fries or whatever?" And they'll say, "You want some?" And I said, "What can you assume?" "Oh, you can assume from the question that I want your fries or whatever." It's not an argument. There's no missing premise. It's just based on what I said, what other idea was probably bouncing around in my head. And that's the way to think about these kinds of inferences in reading comp, I think.
Gotcha. That's a really useful illustrative example. Thank you for that. What do you make of this idea that, the LSAT reuses questions and just changes certain small details or the topic? I'm thinking in particular of a couple of logic games over the years that have been virtually identical copies of each other.
They're few and far between, but I have noticed a few as well. They're usually pretty darn good about developing original feeling material, but I have noticed a couple of logic games spread out over maybe 30 or 40 tests that had virtually the same logical structure. Even the statements of the rules were virtually word for word the same. But that to my experience is pretty rare. So I wouldn't recommend that people look for that or place too much stock in that.
No, I agree with you. I think that it happens rarely, and if anything, they're becoming better about throwing more curveballs. Have you noticed any recent trends in any aspect of the exam in recent years?
Yeah, they've changed some of the AR questions. So there's that devilish AR item now that asks you to recognize, identify an equivalent rule. Which one of the following is substituted for the rule, blah, 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 would have the same effect, blah, blah, blah. That's a tough item type to get on top of, I think. And that's new. There are a few subtle changes, I think, to LR. They used to have questions that asked, which of the following is a statement that the two interlocutors disagree over. Much more frequently now they ask which one do they agree with respect to than disagree. A few other subtle changes in the LR, but it still is feels very much like the test that they redesigned back in, I guess it was '92, when ACT took over the contract from ETS. Those old tests still feel pretty similar to the new tests. So
Yeah, the LSAT's just remarkable in how consistent it's been over time. And I'm wondering, what happens behind the scenes? Is it lots of testing, lots of quality control? What sort of insights do you have into that end of it?
I've worked for several different item writing outfits, Pearson, ETS, and LSAC through ACT. And there is no question but that they put much more energy and work into editing the items, testing the items. When it's been a long time since I've done this, and things may have changed, but they had, after the item writers, they had 3 different levels of editorial review. And back even 20, 25 years ago, when we would go to item writing workshops, they would claim that they would spend $1,000 in development for every item that they produced. And I know I was only getting like 90 of it. So they put a lot of energy, a lot of effort into making sure that those items are very good. It's extremely rare that you see an item that's been rejected because for lack of soundness. So and you can pick up pretty much any other of the tests that you might name, and you'll have to hold your nose and pick an answer with some of those questions in a way you just don't have to do with the LSAT.
Yeah, it's really incredible. I mean, at this point, we're at nearly 100 released exams, 86 of which are numbered, and then a bunch of unnumbered ones. And out of all of those, I think there's only been less than a dozen items redacted from scoring, removed from the exam. So it really is quite remarkable.
Especially when you consider that the test pool is much more litigious than maybe MCAT test takers.
Yeah, I'm sure pre-laws are definitely challenging questions more than pre-meds, I would think. One thing that comes to mind now is the LSAT is, of course, being offered more frequently going forward, something like 10 exams per year, in contrast to the previous 4 per year. And so I'm imagining that LSAC may be in the position where they have to create more new test forms because they can only reuse the exams so much. And with a cost of $750,000 or something like that per test form, what are they going to do? I know this is just speculation, but how are they going to handle that? It's a big expense.
Yeah, excellent question. I imagine they've been gearing up for this for several years. So they've probably brought on a slew of item writers and have been training them for a long time and have built up their test bank. When they were talking about going online years ago, they had a similar ramp up, and then they made the decision to stick with paper and pencil. But I imagine it was similar. That is to say, they realized they were going to need roughly twice as many items, and so they don't make these decisions rashly. So I'm sure they've been working on this for a long time.
Yeah, I'm sure they have too. I know I've seen the studies over the past several years, and now it's actually happening. Digital LSATs coming in July, and then September 100% full force.
Right.
And I'm wondering what you think of this new format, if you've had any exposure to it or seen the online tool. What are your thoughts and how that changes things for test takers?
I don't think it's going to be that big a change. Um, I think people tend to underestimate um, uh, the extent to which these tests are very delivery specific. That is to say, if once it's digital, you want to become familiar with the digital format and study with the digital format. There's a big difference between scrolling and having a page in front of you. And but once folks adjust their preparation to the new format, I don't think it's going to be that big a deal. I've played around with it a little bit. It seems easy enough to work with, and I don't think it's going to really create very many problems for folks.
Yeah,
What do you think?
I think it could be better. I wish that they would allow you to draw freehand on the tablet, which would more closely mimic the paper and pencil format. The tablet seems somewhat limited in what you can do with it. So I'm not personally that impressed by it. I wish they had been a bit more user focused. I think some people, of course, will do fine no matter what, but for others, it could be a struggle. And since I even spoke with one person who said that the tablet was very glitchy during a pilot run of it. And with the same 35-minute constraint, that could pose a problem. So I'm imagining that in July, when half of test takers get paper and pencil, half get digital, there may be a slightly higher average score on the paper format versus the digital. But I guess time will tell the results.
And I bet we haven't seen the final version of this either. We're kind of in a sit back and wait and see approach with respect to, excuse me, changing our curriculum to reflect the change. And so we're probably going to give it a few months and let things settle in before we, decide how we're going to change our curriculum to reflect that change.
Yeah, that seems wise. I think that they just released the online tool this in January, and the first full or at least big rollout of the digital is July. So they've still got 6 months to play around with it and hopefully make some tweaks and improvements. So I guess we'll see. I wanted to ask you just to come back to content for a minute. When it comes to developing good LSAT questions, I've often thought about the layers of complexity involved in an LSAT question. So there are ways they could make a question more difficult by maybe requiring a student to take the contrapositive, or to link together conditional statements, or to navigate tricky words like unless. Have you noticed anything in terms of parsing that out in your analysis of questions?
No, I think you're exactly right. Contrapositive is a common trick they use to disguise things. Yeah, they're a bag of tricks. A good example I like is when an item writer might be writing, let's say a necessary assumption item. Very often, I mean, I can't speak for everyone, but what I would do is I would write the stimulus and then go eat lunch and come back and think of a counterexample. And then the key would just be not that. And so then to cover my tracks, I would have to make sure that there would be enough other answer choices that had negations in them, or else you just, that would be a really nice way to game those questions. So there are a lot of subtleties to crafting the items in ways that help to camouflage the correct answer, that don't involve tricky things like contrapositive, but more straightforward. The other item writer's trick, comparisons. When in doubt, throw in a comparison, because they seem plausible whether they're going to key or not. So always have some comparisons in your back pocket when you're trying to come up with some attractive distractors.
I love it. So yeah, this is exactly what I love to think about, is the patterns in tempting wrong answer choices. I can imagine that there are certain bags of, you said there's a bag of tricks, and every now and then you pull out your old favorites and make that really attractive choice A, so then you never even get to the correct one.
Well, this is why I think it's a big adjustment for a lot of people when they study. They're so obsessed with trying to figure out what the correct answer is, but they should spend 80 or 90% of their time trying to figure out what the wrong answers are. Because those are the things you see over and over and over again, those distractor strategies. And the more efficient you are at getting it down to 2 answer choices quickly, I think over the long haul, the better off you're going to be. So yeah, that's exactly right. The distractor strategies show up over and over and over again. And that's the way I think to make the biggest improvement, study those.
Awesome, definitely. So is that something that you work with students, you teach courses, do you kind of break this down in terms of different distractors, or just showing students the patterns?
Just as we work through items, I'll point out that, this is something you'll see quite frequently. The comparison says something like the lower the cholesterol level, the lower the blood pressure or something. And then an answer choice will say folks with low cholesterol have low blood pressure. And that distinction between an absolute and a comparison shows up all the time, right? So fortunately, the items themselves teach all these lessons. It's just a matter of, as you're working through them, like sightseeing, like bird watching. A lot of this is like bird watching. It really is. It's all sort of staring you in the face, but unless somebody says, no, notice the little tuft, or notice the band around the leg or something, right? And once you see that, you can't help but notice it again. But yeah, it's all sort of obvious if you know what to look for.
Yeah, if you know what to look for, exactly. And so I think I love that example with the bird watching. You're kind of looking for those small details, those small nuances, and spotting what's the method of reasoning or the trick underlying a question to help you unlock it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. One thing you said to me a while back that stuck with me, because I've often felt the same, is that you don't need to necessarily work through every exam ever released, that even just like 10 exams or so could be enough, because it is about really studying the items. Could you talk a bit more about that, and maybe what you recommend students look for when they're analyzing their thought patterns, analyzing questions, et cetera?
Yeah, you're exactly right. I think you're way better off knowing, sticking with logical reasoning. I mean, games might be slightly different. It might be to your advantage to be exposed to as many of the games in some sense or other as you can. But with logical reasoning, you're way better off, I think, knowing a few hundred items inside and out, backwards and forwards, because that's when those distractor strategies stand out. Once you really understand the nuts and bolts of these things, the details, how they're put together, why certain answer choices tend to show up, that's when you're more likely to start to get these things right. So one thing I often say is people want to take lots of sample tests, and I say taking sample Lsats is like trying to lower your blood pressure by checking it all the time. You really don't learn a lot from taking tests. You're way better off taking a very narrow topic and studying that narrow topic. So in games, just set up games that involve conditional statements. Don't even do their items. Take necessary assumption items and just spend an hour and a half doing nothing but necessary assumption items to help you distinguish them from sufficient assumption items. So the more narrowly you focus a study session on a particular task, I think the better those tricks stick. So
those are some really valuable insights, really focusing, doing things by type, getting the nuances down.
Right.
Yeah, I think the Lsat has so many nuances, and probably a lot more than the GRE does, I imagine. What's your take on the rise of the GRE in law school admissions? And I understand that I think you said that you teach the GRE as well.
Yeah. The GRE is going after everybody, aren't they?
Yeah.
GMAT administrations have steadily decreased over the last several years. Most business schools accept GREs for admissions in the some of their programs, if not all of them. Um, uh, I don't think, with respect to law school, I don't think anybody who's not getting in with an LSAT is going to get in by taking a GRE. That's really not what the purpose behind allowing the GRE to count for law school admissions. That's really not the purpose of that. Clearly, things have changed over the last year or two, but test administrations were plummeting, or more to the point, law school admissions were plummeting. Schools were having a really hard time attracting students. The number of matriculants has started to go back up a bit, but I think this was just a way for them to try to attract a very small number of students who wouldn't have considered law school if they had to take an extra test, but do extremely well on the GRE, and then they might as well apply to law school while they have what they need to. So I don't think it's really to the advantage of anyone who's on the cusp of getting in to law school. I think if you can't get in with an LSAT, you're probably not going to get in with a GRE.
Well, that makes a lot of sense to me. And the question also is, how seriously are you taking the law school admission process if you're not even willing to take the LSAT, which is the primary exam for admission and the one that is shown to correlate with 1L grades?
Right.
Yeah. Well, Dr. House, this has been a pleasure connecting with you. Any final words you want to share with the audience and everyone studying for the LSAT?
Boy, I think you've covered a lot of it. Focus on narrow tasks when you study. Most of the time, after you've taken 3 or 4 practice tests, you're probably better off taking a nap than another test. Don't think you have to work through all 80 tests to do well. Grab 10 or 20, understand those 10 or 20 thoroughly. That's probably the best advice I can think of.
Solid advice there. Thank you for sharing that. And you teach in-person prep courses for a variety of exams, right? Is there a certain place I can point people to find out more about what you offer, or to follow you, connect with you?
Oh, sure, Steve. We're educational testing consultants, and we have a website. There's a little information about my partners there, and that should be anything anybody wants to know about us right there. Educational testing consultants.
Perfect. All right. Well, yeah.
I was going to say, easily confused with educational testing services, I might add.
Yeah, quite a bit of similarity there. You guys are ETC. Yeah. But I'll definitely make sure to link folks there and point them over in that direction.
Right,
Dr. Harris.
ETC, right.
Yeah, and thank you so much for joining. I'm sure everyone will really find it valuable. And if you're open to it, I'd love to do this again sometime.
Much more pleasant than the dentist, Steve. Thanks. It wasn't as bad as I thought. We can probably do this again.
Awesome. All right. Well, I really appreciate it again, sir. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure, Steve. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.